So I'm going to call our meeting to order. This is the December 18th meeting of the Addison Central School District Board. As I did last week, I just want to talk a little bit about the process tonight. As Peter said, we've got a lot of new information, so we're going to change our process tonight. Normally we would have a public comment period right at the beginning, but I think some of the information we're going to receive might be important to many of you. The public comment period, I'll still offer it for anybody who needs to leave early or who is here to talk about something besides the budget. What we'll have tonight, we have some business to take care of, agenda approving and minutes and all that. And we're going to move into a presentation that goes over a lot of the new information. And when that presentation wraps up, I'm going to give the board a chance to ask questions of the presenters. After the board has had a chance to ask questions, we want to give you the opportunity as well to ask questions or make comments based on the new information that you'll be getting. We're going to contain the time, probably keep it to about 20 minutes, and we'll kind of continue on from there. We just got new information. It has to do with the math involved with calculating equalized pupils. The bigger experts on this than I am will explain it a little bit as we move into that portion of things. But we'll begin with our general business, and then we'll move right into the presentation and the budget conversation. I just want to make a couple of quick comments. One, we've decided to keep these meetings in the band room despite the large numbers of people who are coming. It seems to be a little bit better. I think it's a little less formal than using the auditorium and the stage. If anybody wants to weigh in on that after the meeting and let me know which you think works better. We want to make sure you can hear us and we can hear you. Please feel free to comment on that. I also want to just take a quick moment to thank Lorraine Morris, our board member at the end. Second meeting in a row. These meetings are catered except by her. They are her baked goods that are providing us with the energy that we all need to get through these long meetings. And Lorraine, just want to make a public thank you to you.
Thank you, Lorraine.
So anyway, we'll get rolling, and we're kind of calling audibles as we go here, and we'll do the best we can to make sure the information gets out for everybody. So we're going to begin the meeting with introductions, and obviously Lorraine's at the end. Lorraine, would you begin?
Josh Quinn, Business Manager. Peter Burrows, Superintendent.
I'm Peter Conlon.
Nick Colston.
Steve Orzak.
Jen Newsier.
Victoria Jetty.
Jason Duquette Hoffman. Perry Hansen.
So as I said, if anybody needs to leave early or is here to comment about something besides the budget, now would be a good time to take advantage of that. And if not, we'll postpone some of that until we get the new information out. Yes?
Sorry, I can't see the end.
That's okay. If you just give us your name and what town you're from.
Jason Chance, I'm from Millbury. I just wanted to say that I would like the board to explore options that are not level funded, so a modest increase in the budget, if that means not cutting, double-digit paraprofessionals from very large classrooms. So I respect the idea of keeping everything level funded and keeping the budget as low as possible, but it seems pretty drastic when I think we may be able to absorb a small increase in the budget. I'd also like to see numbers on total cost to operate each school building in the district, and see that as per pupil cost too. That's just the operating cost without actually teaching a single class. What does it cost just to keep the building open and maintaining the lights on for each building? That's it.
Thanks very much. Anyone else? Thank you. Okay, could I have a motion to approve the minutes from December 11th? Thank you, Victoria. Second? Yes. Second? Anybody? Jump in. Lorraine, thank you. We have one change that Nick mentioned to me, and that is the results of the vote on the second motion was incorrectly reported in the minutes. Suzanne's made the change. Anybody else have anything they want to bring up minutes-wise? If not, all those in favor of approving the minutes of 12/11/17, please say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Anybody abstaining? Perry is abstaining. Thank you. We do have some bills to pay, and Ruth, you going to report that out? A bill to pay.
We have bills for today, December 18th. Mary and Victoria signed the bills, $331,343.12 from the general fund. Yeah, that's, I don't have the paper here. You can look at my phone. And then a bag of glasses.
Motion?
Motion to approve the bills.
Mary seconds. All those in favor of the bills as presented, paying the bills as presented, please say aye. Aye. Anybody opposed? Anybody abstaining? And we've paid the bills. All right, so now we move into our main item here, the continued discussion on our budget. Just a couple of technical things to point out. Some people have asked about the timing of why we budget, why we discuss what we do when we do. And I think there's a certain level of frustration on all of our parts that we are discussing things and then new information comes in and then we have to rediscuss them. But we have certain legal obligations to warn meetings in a certain amount of time. And even though we don't vote on the budget until, or the community doesn't vote on the budget until town meeting day, we have to make sure warnings are in place, annual reports are printed, and all of that. So that's just a little bit about the timing, and we are statutorily, at this point, unless we were to ever change it, supposed to vote on our budget on town meeting day, the first Tuesday in March, after the first Monday. So that's kind of why we do what we do. So we're going to get a presentation here from the Finance Committee and then from the administration regarding some of this new budget information and the continued conversation. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Ruth Hardy, Chair of the Finance Committee.
Hello, everybody, again. Thank you so much for coming. It's so great to see all of you, and I have some good news for everybody. Hopefully you've all looked at those sheets. I'm going to go over them really briefly, and then Josh and Peter are going to give a presentation on more of the details. Then, as Peter said, the board will ask questions, and then you guys will get a chance to ask some questions. But the bottom line is, last night, literally yesterday afternoon, we got information from the state that changed our equalized pupil counts to the good, gaining 53.72 students. Now, I just want to explain that those are not like real students. It's not that 53 kids just moved into the district yesterday afternoon. It's the way that the state calculates enrollment, particularly at the pre-K level. As many of you know, we run a public pre-K program through some of our elementary schools and then through contracts with local pre-K providers. And the way that those students are counted in our pupil counts is a little funky. And last year, it was an issue in that we got some of those students taken away in our counts. And this year, they seem to have given us those students back. And we didn't anticipate that. So we were budgeting without those students in our counts, and therefore we had a lower count, and that's why you saw some of the budget decisions that we were moving toward last week. So that those 54 new fake students gives us an extra $522,000 approximately, almost $523,000 to the good, meaning that we can still shoot for a level funded budget with fewer reductions. I want to caution you that we literally just now, the whole board, first the Finance Committee and then the rest of the board, were told this. There are administrators in the room who have not even heard this information yet. So this is hot off the press. We're still working through it, and we may not have all the answers at this point. But what Josh and Peter have worked really hard to put together, what you see on your handouts, and the changes. I'm going to go over the changes. Most of you, I think, how many of you were here last week? Most of you, lots of you. Okay, so we went over this last week. Many of you have seen it, even if you weren't here. But the differences are that the 5% reduction across the board for non-salary costs that was going to be in technology and equipment and professional development and school-based supplies, that remains, except for the small amount for professional development was put back in, so that the professional development budget, which is really quite small, as it is, it's about $100,000, will remain whole, so that our teachers can have adequate professional development. We'll still see 2.6 positions through attrition reduced, and those are positions that are not filled this year, and we wouldn't fill them next year. There's still projected savings from retirements of 6 positions, and those are positions for teachers who would take early retirement. That's a program that's been offered by the board saying, we're going to give you an incentive to retire either early or on time and make it a little easier for you financially. There still would be 3 elementary school teachers reduced from 3 of our smaller elementary schools, Salisbury, Cornwall, and Shoreham. Those would result in combined classes at some of the grades, and those decisions on which classes to combine would be up to the principals in that school. It's not a board decision. But those 3 elementary school teachers would most likely be reduced through retirements, because there are quite a number of elementary school teachers who are eligible for retirements. At the central office, a reduction of half of an administrative position rather than a full administrative position. So from 1.0 FTE down to 0.5 FTE. And last week we proposed reducing 1.6 of the principals in our smaller elementary schools. Those principals would be reinstated in the current proposed budget with the intention that they would be reduced in FY20 in the following year, so that it would give the administration a year to prepare for those reductions of those elementary school principals. So that reduction would come out of this budget. We would reduce the number of reductions in teachers, if that makes any sense, at our MUMS and our high school. So instead of 5 teachers at MUMS, it would be 3 teachers at MUMS, and instead of 6 teachers at MUHS, it would be 4 teachers at MUHS. Those are, as we explained last week, a result of literally fewer students. So these are actual real kids, not the fake pre-K kids. So next year we're projecting 30 fewer students at MUMS and 50 fewer students at the high school. So those teacher reductions would be in response to fewer kids in our classrooms at these schools. But it is fewer reductions. Negative there. And at the paraprofessional level, last week you'll recall there were 18 paraprofessionals proposed for reductions. This week we've been able to reduce that number to 8, and it would be 4 at Mary Hogan, 1 at Ripton, 1 at MUMS, and 2 at MUHS at the high school. So instead of 18, it would be down to 8. There are 40 paraprofessionals at Mary Hogan School, 40 paraprofessionals at Mary Hogan School, just want you all to know that. This would be reducing 4 of them, so that would only be a 10% reduction in the number of paraprofessionals. So there would still be quite a few paras there. And we would add $40,000 to budget for summer curriculum work for our teachers who are helping us to, are doing the hard work of transitioning our school to an international baccalaureate, providing some funding so that the administration and our teachers can work on that over the summer and actually get paid to do it. So that's where we're at. And when Superintendent Burrows texted me last night, I emailed him back and said, "It's a Hanukkah miracle," because I was literally in the middle of eating latkes. So I think it's good news. It's not everything that everybody might want, but it's a better situation than we were in last week. So I'm going to turn it over to Josh and Peter to give their presentation.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. So my goal in the slides that I'm presenting is to talk a little bit more about both some of the questions that came up in our meeting last week, as well as talking a little bit more about some things that I think are important right now as we're looking at this budget year and as we're looking ahead. So our process, FY19 budget process, this is the first year where our new unified board has really had to grapple with some significant decisions. Last year was our first unified budget. We made a decision last year to just roll over that budget. So we took all of our individual budgets from all of our schools and said, we're going to put these together. We knew that in bringing budgets together that it would be challenging, and we'd start down this road of having conversations about equity, about how are we going to staff all of our schools, all those kinds of things that we're beginning to work with right now. So this is the first year of starting that work, and I think it's challenging. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. We knew coming into this budget year that it would be challenging just based on some things that happened for us last year and knowing where our enrollment was going. The state pressure has been increasing, and that's kind of over here. Sometimes it's white noise and sometimes it's other things. When we received the news that there would be a clawback of some of our savings from healthcare, that was scary in terms of thinking about planning and preparing for what the state might do in terms of our funding, and especially retroactively when we didn't have a chance to plan for that. We last year had $790,000 that we put into a reduction in taxes, so that was the fund balance that we used to reduce taxes. Part of that was because of I think the promise that was made to communities that we would work to suppress taxation as we unify. As we went through and started to gather data on FY19, so FY19 is next year's budget. Again, we knew that it was going to be challenging. We, for the first year, started working with our finance committee, so this is a new committee. It was not, we didn't use a finance committee last year. They have been with us throughout the fall and have been really instrumental in providing leadership throughout this process. Josh and I, and I think the whole central office administration staff have been working with our principals and bringing them some of our thinking. They were very helpful in terms of providing feedback. As you can imagine, this is really challenging for principals who are in a place of both seeing what the district vision is, but also, and I think rightly so, are charged with really taking care of their school and their community. In the same way that the conversations we're having about proposed reductions are hard if it's in your community, and a lot of times you want to say, it's great to reduce, but not in my community. Over there is fine. So I think in the same way, this is a challenging transition for principals who had a very different role in the budget process previously as individual districts as they do now, where they're in a very different role. And they're not having those conversations with the board anymore. So that's a transition that we've been working through and will continue to do so. And then finally, we sent out the community survey just to gather some information. The finance committee did accept all of that, look through all that data, and used it to really help guide where we were going. I would say overall, in terms of the information we gathered from the survey, it was really not clear this is the direction to go. And I think that speaks to our kind of both, we have some shared visions as an entire community, but we also really differ. And that's work we're going to be doing. Yeah?
How many surveys did you get?
350. That's not bad.
That's a lot. Well, I guess from all the towns?
Yeah. But as surveys go, that was pretty helpful.
That's a really good response.
I was just wondering,
I was.
so many people.
Yeah. I wanted to start out just by talking about meeting all student needs in all of our communities. And I think during budget season, especially when there are reductions, it's very easy to get into the thinking about your community and your community alone. And I think it's a challenge that we face when we have to make these kinds of decisions. And it's really, really important, my own feeling is that it's really, really important that we work together throughout this process. We have a lot of challenging conversations ahead. We can do it in a deficit kind of mindset, or we can do it in a growth mindset. And the challenges we have between, for example, the perspectives of Middlebury versus perspectives of small towns, all of the different things that I think came up in our meeting last week, that are going to continue to be important for us to be able to have dialogue together, to be as transparent as we can, and to make decisions as a district, as a larger community. I know this will take some time, but I'm trying to lead that work with all of our schools. And I just wanted to mention that, but I think it's really important as we go through this process that we're thinking about that, and we're thinking about what are the repercussions of what we say and do as we continue the work together in the years to come. So we spent really two to 3 years going through a process of strategic planning and looking at where do we want to go. What we heard through the process of talking with communities and students and teachers was that we're not happy with status quo. We want something bigger, different. We want more. We looked at our data. We looked at all sorts of things, and we realized we could grow and change. We are right in the middle of beginning that change in our implementation, in our movement through IB. And I think it's at times like this, when we're challenged financially, that it's easy to just say, we've got too much going on, we can't do that. And right now is the time that we really need that more than ever. We need to be moving together towards an end that's going to get us to all those objectives, all the vision that we laid out in our strategic plan. One of the questions that came up in our last meeting was about International Baccalaureate and the cost of International Baccalaureate. And I've got a slide in a minute to show you what those costs are. Even if the cost was more than what we spent before, we need to think about what we're doing to really change to today's students and what they need and invest in them. And to think about continuing everything kind of status quo in terms of how we fund is going to keep us where we are. Year by year, our line items are going to go up and down. As we look at how we're doing with our vision, we look at how far we're going, and we make decisions that could change some of the structures in our schools. And I think we have to be open about that and look at that and dialogue about that and then move forward. It's about funding our vision. And it's challenging work. Cost of IB, with the candidacy fees are $85,000 a year. The development of our ACSD budget, our professional development budget, year to year, when we combine all of the funds together, there was no increase in the total cost for IB. That also included significant training this past pre-service, which will lessen over time. That was a pretty big expense to get started. Our staffing was redirection of existing curriculum positions. We did not add there. We anticipate the addition of a 0.5 or 1.0 PYP, which we're going to use through a lateral shift of staffing that's currently already in place, so not in addition. And we are receiving $25,000 a year from the college as part of our ACSD Middlebury partnership. Again, even if the picture looked different, this investment is about connecting all of us together and shifting and moving together to the kind of teaching and learning system that we've laid out as being imperative to change and become the district that we want to become. There are questions about supports and needs. Wes?
Just a question on the federal monies that are being allocated for IB. Are they going to be the same this coming FY period as they are this year, or do you know that?
We don't know yet, yeah. We haven't.
And if they're not, how do you anticipate filling that void?
Well, the expense that we had this past year with the pre-service training, we don't have, so we won't need to fill that hole. I think we have, I mean, we've already taken a look ahead and we feel like we are set in terms of what we have allocated. And we'll talk about that more on the 2nd at our next meeting where we have our first real draft and we have more information. We're still in outline phase right now, so this is our 2nd meeting where we're kind of talking about some of the big numbers, but we're really not talking about specifics. So we'll have more information on the 2nd. There were questions about how do we support students in need. So just so everyone knows, the federal Title I funding is at Mary Hogan, Shoreham, Bridport, and Salisbury a total of $445,000. Those funds can be used for a variety of purposes. They can be used to fund interventionists, they can be used to purchase things, they can be used for professional development, and are used in lots of different ways in our schools. So that's one way that our schools are, you guys not trying to say. Perry, can you lift up the screen? Our 3 schools that don't qualify are Weybridge, Cornwall, Ripton, and Momsen, the high school as well. Yeah.
On the note of professional development for IB, did the cost of the professional development for teachers come out of their professional development assets?
No.
So it's not out of their personal professional?
No, that's a contractual right, so even if, we could zero out that line, but we'd still have to pay for it somewhere.
Just
So
clarifying. Thank you.
we have that. But that is housed within the whole professional development budget. So we talked a little bit about ratios last week. So here's just an overview to see FY19 rollover and then FY19 proposed. This is students to classroom teachers. We talked last meeting about licensed staff to classroom teachers. The next slide has licensed staff. It's really hard to be comparative, especially beyond elementary school, when you look at just classroom teacher, because to define classroom teacher at the middle school and high school level is a bit different. Most school districts use licensed staff for allocation, and then principals tend to be able to use those funds to say, okay, let's say I've got a large middle school, and I've got, let's say I've got 40 teaching positions, but I really, really need another guidance counselor. So my allocation was X, and I would use some of that funding, and I would use the licensed staff FTE to purchase a guidance counselor. So that's how it, I think, normally works. So this gives you a sense of where numbers are and where we are proposing them based on changes, based on those 3 blended classes that we discussed. And then here's students to licensed FTE. Licensed FTE includes the core academic classes, it includes counselors, it includes librarian, it includes world language, so all the kind of either the teaching positions or the licensed positions in the school. Yeah.
So are you saying that FY19 is with the reductions that are in this paper? Is
Yep.
that what the changes are?
Yep.
Okay, so is it accounting for any drop in enrollment or projected?
Yes.
Yes, both of those things?
Yes.
So there were questions about administration and the massive administration in ACSD. There have not been central office administration adds to the general fund, at least since I've been here. There have been additions in terms of departments adding positions or people coming and having an office in the central office. But those have either been grant funded or have used funds from either the technology department or other departments to fund those positions. It's hard to define what administration is. We did add, for example, and this wasn't a central office admin position, but there was an ad of a facilities manager for the elementary schools, I think 4 years ago. That cost was shared by each individual district. So, I mean, some people may define that as administration, they may not. I just want to let everybody know we have not been adding positions at the central office from the general fund. So there were questions last time about building systemic supports. We are in the process of developing an ACSD inclusionary model, and that is work that is really going alongside our development of IB, and will continue. Part of what we're looking at in terms of that process is what is the role in terms of paraprofessionals, behavioral and academic interventionists, and having this be an entire model. And so part of what came up last time and what I think we need to talk about further is what is the role of the paraprofessional in the classroom? How can that be part of a greater system? And I think that's going to require a lot of conversation with all of you to work on developing that.
Can you just explain for folks who might not be familiar with the terminology what the inclusionary model is?
Sure, it's a model looking at students with various needs. Inclusionary means including them into Tier 1 or the general ed curriculum. Did that make sense?
So for a parent, what might that mean for parents of students in a classroom?
So it's support for a student to support them in the context of their general ed classroom. So including them, inclusionary in. It also pertains to Tier 2 and Tier 3 as well. So it's part of a greater multi-tiered system of supports. Vic, anything to add?
I would say pretty much the same. It's looking at taking students with and without disabilities, and lots of students are pulled out of the general ed class for services that are supplanting the core instruction within the classroom, and looking at how do we get more kids accessing the core instruction and how do we support that model.
So does that mean a move away from things like DO, Alt-Ed, and the Tiger program?
No, we don't have a similar program.
There is a similar.
We don't have any.
No, we moved
What's
away.
Tug? What is Tug?
I think that's more through counseling services.
This doesn't.
So I say, when you say a model
Yeah.
development, if you're building a model, that means
Yeah.
you're moving towards a vision, right? So I'm just wondering how those things fit in that vision.
Certainly, those are part of the development of this model. This doesn't mean that we don't have any programs that are outside of the general ed classroom. But it's working to support students in general ed classrooms. Yeah.
Can you just clarify how this overlaps with the sort of Title I, or no, I guess what I mean is IDEA funded supports for students that qualify for special ed. How do these two things overlap?
Their special ed is pretty specific about what you can bill for special ed and what you can't.
Right.
So we have a number of positions where someone is working both in general ed and in special ed based on time studies, looking at what they do every day, and they have to actually keep track of that. So this is not purely special education. It's really a dovetail of both. Yeah.
Can I just interrupt for 1 second? For those of you who are standing, there are empty seats kind of sprinkled throughout. Feel free to come in and check, but if you're happy back there, that's fine too. Maybe if you have a seat next to you, raise your hand and people can fill in as they'd like. Thank you.
So Peter and Jen.
Oh, yeah. I didn't know you had that slide. Like, what am I on here?
Do you want to share about
this is just to indicate there were some questions that came up last week, and we've had some comments online about, well, what's the future of schools and this and that, and this is just to say that there's a process underway. It's a relatively new process to Vermont and school systems in Vermont, but to come up with, we have a committee that is working on a master plan. And this is when I say a committee working on it, we're working on a process to develop a master plan, which will be very inclusive of the community in that process. But it is to look at the information that we have at our fingertips in terms of future enrollment, conditions of buildings, international baccalaureate, what's best for kids, and kind of put it all together in a plan that will act as a guiding document for boards in the future, and looking out 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And this is really just to say that that work is starting and is getting underway.
Can I just ask if is it possible, short person request for anyone who's speaking up there to stand up?
Oh, absolutely, sorry.
People in the room.
Yes.
It's a nice way of saying it. Okay, so I'm now going to introduce Josh to go through some numbers. That's what we're doing.
So equalized pupils, we got that confirmed over the weekend, and that went up to 1821, as we said earlier, which is an increase of 53. Equalized pupils is an often discussed topic in business manager meetings. It's BASBO, and keeps lots of us up at night. Why can't you predict that with more clarity? This is what equalized pupils has done over the past, well, since my time here. Spike sign at the end. So this, is there a pointer?
Yes.
So right here, that was the entrance of universal pre-K. So that was the program that we can count 0.46 of a pre-K student, and so all of our partner programs that receive $3,192. The equalized pupils increased and bumped up to that in FY17. So last year, in the first year, we said, okay, great, that should stay relatively flat. Our enrollment, our ADM, which is a 2-year average, looking at the current year and back 1 year, was nearly exactly the same. And this year, or last year at this time, our number dropped down to 1767 and threw us in the tailspin right about this same time. That was, yeah.
Just to clarify, where did those numbers come from?
Those numbers come from the state.
Okay.
So we do an enrollment study basically from the 10th day of school through the 30th day of school, and where they collect our average daily membership, and then they calculate based on that an equalized pupil number, which is a very complicated. They weight students, and then they take the entire weighted student population of the whole state and multiply it by a factor that they just basically come up with. And then they redistribute those across the state. Yes?
So what is this number like, this equalized number like supposed to represent an approximation of how many students are in our district?
What it does, it weights students, so they consider secondary students as more expensive, so secondary students get weighted higher. English language learners, ELL students are also more expensive, so they get weighted higher. Students in poverty are also weighted higher. So it's trying to, I think, probably distribute resources based on need in the different communities and towns. That's my guess. So last year at this time when I was talking to the state about why our number dropped so much, their answer was UPK, and that in this FY17 year, we reported too many UPK students. And so in FY17, we all paid too few taxes because of the number that was reported the year before that. So last year, 1767, was the state reclaiming those taxes that we should have paid the year before. They had told me at this time last year that it would take 2 years for us to get that money back because it's the study of this year, then you look backwards a year as well. My conversation on Sunday basically said, no, you got all those back this year. So that's why we're now at 1821. So that's equalized pupils in summary, I'd say. So level funding by equalized pupils, I wanted to sort of give you guys an idea of what that means and how we're looking at it. So in FY18, we had 1767 equalized pupils. Our cost per pupil for this current year, which is FY18, is $17,216 per equalized pupil. We're including in our numbers the reduction of 2 cents in our tax incentive that we received for unifying. So we got 10 cents in this current year, and we'll get 8 cents in the budget we're now preparing. That, in essence, equals about $355,000. You divide that by our equalized pupils of this current year, it's about $200 per equalized pupil. So level funding by equalized pupil, as we look from this year to next year, would be 17,216 minus that 2 cent reduction that we're losing, so 17,015 per equalized pupil. I know this is very exciting. So FY19, we now have 1,821 equalized pupils. So the macro level adjustment, so that is the itemized items on the, I'm not sure which page it is. The first page. So we kind of looked at that a little bit. I sent a very similar thing out to this last week. So macro level, that's items really 4 through 13. Anything 4 through 10, that's an expenditure adjustment. So those are things like the automatic salary and payroll cost increases, universal pre-K, so that money is going up. They're going to give us more money. It's based on the need rate, which is basically CPI. We have 7 more kids at the end of this year as well. Hannaford Career Center, last week that's in italics because that's changed from last week. So we sat down with Hannaford's and we reviewed the numbers again. And so basically with our updated information, instead of being an additional cost of $54,000, it's actually a decrease of $63,000, which is great. Other built-in increases, so contractual services that are tied to CPI, CSAC contract stuff that we don't really control. Transportation cost, budget savings, those are healthcare plan savings, so we're estimating a 60% usage of the HRA fund from our employees who have HRAs. We don't really have very good information. That's the same number that the state used when they issued the clawback, which is them taking the money away from us. And then natural gas conversion. So last year, we put in dual fuel natural gas burners in both the middle school and the high school, and we expect that to save us around $50,000 in fuel costs. So that's included in this macro level adjustment. And additional positions we talked about last week. In revenue adjustments, so that's a negative number, so that's a decrease in revenue, so that's money we have to make up. Healthcare recapture of the state, so that's $166,000 for next year, that's $310,000 this year. Prior year fund balance, and used $790,000 of fund balance last year to reduce our taxes, so we need to make that money up as well. And then federal funding, so there's $175,000 we anticipate not receiving in Title II funds. So, if you take those macro level adjustments, that equals $1.52 million, which, if you take the $1.52 million, and so if you add that, now we're going to move to the FY18 to 19 summary, the big spreadsheet. So FY19 rollover, just go all the way down to the bottom where it says equalized, or ed spending for equalized pupil, it says 17,542. So if we just rolled over with all those macro level adjustments, that would be our ed spending per equalized pupil. So if we wanted to level fund that, we got to go back to that 17,015. So the difference of those is $528 per equalized pupil. So you multiply that 528 by our total equalized pupils, and you get $960,000. So to level fund by equalized pupil, we would need to reduce our budget, which is that rollover budget, by $961,000. Yes.
I may not be understanding this correctly, but it looks to me that our ed spending per equalized pupil is going down by $406.21. It's a 2.4% reduction in spending per student on education in the school.
Yes.
Would a level funded budget make that level funded?
Yes. So the FY19 proposed is not, it goes beyond level funding.
So the budget you're proposing is not level funded, it's a reduction in education spending.
Correct.
Beyond below a level funded budget.
Yes.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. I also have a couple questions about administrative costs, but I could ask those some other time if it would be better.
Yeah, let me get through this and then we turn that. The other thing that we're trying to anticipate is declining enrollment, which we'll all talk about. So next year we anticipate losing 50 students from the high school. Those are the most heavily weighted students that we have. So that's our equalized pupil number that we have right now does not look ahead, it looks backwards. So that decline, and I will never try to project equalized pupils, but logic would tell you that losing 50 students, divide that by 2, because only half of the time that they use the ratio would result in declining equalized pupils, but we'll see next year. So this is our enrollment. This is down to FY05. No idea what happened in FY10. This is where we are right now, so in FY18. So we expect to lose 50 next year. Then there's 13 that we lose the following year, 31 the following year, and then it's 5 and then 9. Or something along those lines. So it's about 100 students over the next 5 years. All right.
Thank you, Josh. All right, board members, questions? It's somewhat new information for us. We're also digesting. Josh, the numbers you had there at the end with pupil numbers, those were equalized pupils, not just student count, right?
No, that was student.
The trends of enrollment decline?
No, the slide before that where it actually had numbers of students.
Yes.
They were equalized pupils. Right there, that number.
This is,
No, that's enrollment.
Enrollment, okay, thank you, thank you. Yes, Chip?
Josh, there was a question earlier in the board, when the board was talking too, about how close this number is to the top number that you can have before you have to pay back. I don't know what the terminology is.
Spending threshold.
Spending threshold. Can you talk on that a little bit?
Yeah, so the spending threshold is 17,816. And the proposed, and so just to clarify, so the proposed budget is based on the sheet in your packet that talks about the proposed reductions for FY19. So that's how you get the totals in that proposed column. So it's basically a $1,000 difference from the spending threshold to the ed spending per equalized pupil.
Which is good.
Yeah.
Further board questions? Yes, Victoria?
I'd say Mr. Lessing had a good start to a question there. So if we're looking for level funding, why is the budget not level funded? I know there's reasons. I'm just opening that so one of you can choose to discuss it.
I think I might throw that to Ruth because it was really a finance committee direction.
So this particular budget that we're looking at right now, we literally just got an hour ago or whatever. So, a couple of things that we want to take into consideration are, one, the actual decline in students that we have next year, the fewer kids that we're going to have in this building and at MUMS requires fewer teachers because we're going to have fewer students. Then also looking ahead to the projected enrollment declines that Josh presented on that other slide. If we prepare ahead this year, then we're going to have fewer reductions in future years as a result of those declines in equalized pupils. And so a lot of this is anticipatory. And because we got lucky with these fake UPK students that we got back this year, we can take the opportunity to prepare ahead for the future, basically, over the next 5 years when things are going to get worse and worse and worse each year. So that is the general basis. And we also tried really hard, and this will require probably additional conversations from the board and the committee and the community, but we tried really hard to create a situation where there was a move toward equity in not only in our staffing, but in our staffing at all levels, in the sort of paraprofessional staffing, teacher staffing, and admin staffing. And so sort of setting up that trend toward more equitable staffing across our entire district and looking at our district holistically. There was a question that came up last week. Do you want me to state it? I realize this now. Sorry, Amy. So there was a question that came up last week about, Chris actually asked this question, should we try to bump a little bit closer to the threshold that Chib just mentioned? And we talked about this in the Finance Committee and whether that was a good idea. Should we spend more and get closer to that threshold? And one of a couple factors that we considered were only one of our communities that were now one big community, but one of our previously small communities voted to go over that threshold and get double taxed on the extra in previous years. So there's only a history of one community thinking that that's a road they want to take. And so 1 out of 9 of our communities is small. So we wanted to sort of respect the tradition of, hey, we don't want to bump up against that threshold. The other thing is that we've had 2 of the communities who have bumped up at the threshold, did not want to spend over the threshold, and then had to quickly scramble to cut things at their budget, literally like on town meeting day, what do we cut so our taxes don't go over that threshold, or our spending doesn't go over that threshold and we get double taxed. And that's a really bad position to be in, to be scrambling. We're already clearly scrambling a little bit, and to be scrambling at the last minute to find things to cut on town meeting day is not a good situation to be in. It doesn't allow for planning and thought. So we felt as a committee that we wanted to stay underneath the threshold as much as possible, so that when the inevitable curveball gets thrown our way, we have some wiggle room, and especially now that we're a much bigger and unified district. So that hopefully answers your question, Chris, a little bit, and a little bit to what you were talking about, why we made this decision. It gives us, there's still data that we're waiting for from the state that may change this again. And so on January 2nd, it's likely that we'll be looking at slightly different numbers. So what we're doing at this point is giving ourselves some wiggle room, so that when things change, we don't have to come back to you again. And so actually, it's going to be worse. And so we're doing this seesawing. We're trying to be as transparent and forward-thinking as possible so that we can lessen the impact. We know that it's stressful for many of you, and us too.
Further questions from the board? So we will go 2 ways here. Any further questions, informational questions that anybody here might have? And then I would like to give everybody the opportunity who would like to make a public comment, which we usually do at the start of the meeting, to have that opportunity as well. Is that a question?
Yes, please.
Oh, please.
Hi, my name is Sam Prouty. Just a follow-up to the point you made, that's, to most of us who are sane, that's a very smart thing to do, right? If we forecast ahead that future budget cuts are coming, let's be as sort of conservative as we can be now and offset that. I guess my question is how that relates in our school district relationship to what we were told from Montpelier, which is to say, if we are again asked to provide level funding or some other interesting kind of funding, if we have essentially lowered the starting point, if you follow where I'm going with that, then we are potentially setting ourselves up for our own more drastic cuts in the future if the starting point is lowered.
Well, so,
Do you follow my question?
Yeah.
and I just want to clarify, the issue of level funding our budget was a direction that this board came up with to give to the administration, really thinking about a worst-case scenario in many ways. And things have changed, so it's allowed us to sort of modify that, and that's sort of the direction we're going to be discussing as we go forward.
There's just another thing to add to that question too. I know last year there was conversation about taking high spending, and of course it's really hard to predict what the legislature is going to do, right?
Yes.
And having seen this cycle now for a number of years, each year someone brings a new idea to try to suppress spending, and it ranges all over the place. Last year, there was conversation about using a way to double tax above a certain kind of spending, or not double, but it was a portion, like maybe add a quotient of, I can't remember what the exact number was, but let's say you were spending 14,000, you would be harmless. Over 14, you would be taxed more. Under 14, you would be given like a lower tax rate, or I can't remember how it was computed. So it's hard to predict what is going to come out of Montpelier. What we've had consistently over time is the threshold. That's the one thing that kind of survives the test of many minds moving in different directions.
Any other?
So, I just want to add to the response to your question on a couple levels. One, I think because we're still relatively early in the budget process, and clearly things change pretty rapidly, 7 days, and we're at a radically different number, and we're in a better place. So I think that we felt like we made a lot of progress in what we were able to do, and we're still trying to respond to the realities of our district. We will have fewer kids here next year, and the reality is when you have fewer kids, you need fewer people. So we want to still respond to that reality. The other thing is that giving ourselves, like I said again, some wiggle room, because things are going to change not only in the next few weeks, but then when the legislature gets their hands on it and all this stuff happens there. And so if they do something and we've gotten ourselves into a position where we feel pretty good, we did that last year and we're able to stem some of the pain of the clawback, then we are in a better position. And finally, something that hasn't been really talked about too much is that with this budget, even though it's less than level funded, there's still a 2.1% projected tax rate increase. And so we're still asking our taxpayers to pay more, even though we're spending less, and even though we have fewer kids in our school district. And so bumping up more on our spending will bump up our tax rate. So I think that there needs to be a sort of dual conversation about what is best for our kids first and foremost, what is best for our district, and what is doable for our taxpayers in our district. And as we all remember from last year, we all start with the same tax rate, and then it gets adjusted for common level of appraisal. So our towns all do have varying tax rates in the end because of our property values. And so some of our towns get hit harder than others. And so I think we're trying really hard to be responsible to our taxpayers given the situation. So that's another factor.
I just want to bring something up so everybody can plan their evenings. We will be meeting again on January 2nd as a school board. I think we'll probably have a more detailed budget proposal at that point. That's a Tuesday, not a Monday, obviously because of New Year's Day. Our next tentative scheduled meeting after that is January 11th, which is actually a Thursday, as I recollect. And again, it's as the information becomes available. Yes, Chris, question, I assume?
Yes, Chris Altamos from Middlebury. So education funding, staffing, budget cuts, sounds like we all understand is not going to be easier in the next few years. There was a hint tonight as far as a vision or a plan to move forward as a district. What can you tell us in terms of what we might expect in terms of a process or a timeline for developing such plans?
Oh, you're talking about the master plan?
I'm talking about, yeah, a plan as we move forward to, someone mentioned 2, 3, 5, 10-year plan in terms of moving this district forward so that we don't find ourselves here year after year. As Steve mentioned last week, going through budget cuts year after
Right.
year is very difficult.
Right.
So what are we, there's a hint that this might be coming. Is there any more information about timelines or the process?
So the master plan slide that came up that I talked about and looking forward, that's not a committee that's charged with looking at the district academically. It's really to look at the resources available, the trends that are coming, the facilities that we have, and coming up with a long-term plan that the community can talk about and weigh in on. So so that doesn't answer the concerns that you're bringing up. And then in terms of a long-range plan to address potential declines in enrollment, that does go into part of that. But academically, in a way, we do have to take it year by year as the numbers change and go up and down. But that's part of what this year is, we had talked last week about taking some pretty big steps that hadn't been taken over the years. Some of it was the chickens coming home to roost, but also to look ahead and to not have it be bloodletting year after year. Declining enrollment's a reality. It's a reality we're going to have to continue to face. We can't adjust for all of it next year. We have to adjust for it year after year. I don't know if I answered that well. I sort of said there isn't a definite plan to address it, I think.
Well, I can add to that, Chris, and I'm speaking just for myself, not for the whole board here. I just want to be clear. I think there are some issues that this board and our communities are going to have to address on the sooner rather than later side. And this process really highlighted some of those in people's community reaction from the news they heard last week and the many, many emails that we got from many of you in the audience. So I think that the board will probably prioritize this master planning and include things like Chris said, Peter said, things like our facilities. How many schools do we need to serve the students that we have? Do we have the right number right now, or do we need fewer schools? Do we have the right grade configuration in our schools? Do we have the right staffing patterns? Those are the kinds of things that the board is going to have to look at with, of course, the administration and the community and the staff, and really make that plan on the sooner rather than later side, because I think it's going to continue to come up, and there's a lot of angst and differing opinions. So I guess my answer as an individual board member is that I am super committed to that and challenging my colleagues to do that work. So I think it will happen in the next, hopefully sooner rather than later. That helps.
Further questions? Leonard.
Leonard Barrett from Bridgeport. You may have answered this question last week, or I actually got a couple of them, but I was at a selectmen's meeting. As you remember, last year I was here you had $982,000, I think it was, of fund balance left over, and I wanted you to keep it for capital projects. And we voted to take half of it, give it back to the taxpayers for a few dollars to save on their taxes, which I was against. But I just read in the paper this week that there was another $300,000 added to on that $491,000. Can somebody tell me where that, because that was never discussed at our board meetings. I brought people in at 2 board meetings and it was never discussed. Where did that other $300,000 come from? Because it's $791,000 now.
So in the proposed budget last year, in all discussions, we added a contingency into the expenditure side, and that contingency was always offset by $310,000 of fund balance. And so that was actually set aside. And so in the conversations we had, because the total fund balance, I want to say roughly was $1.2 million. And so when we were talking about what we were going to return back to the taxpayer, that discussion was over the difference of that. So that's 900 and whatever.
82,000.
982,000. So when they divided that in half, that 310 was already going back into the revenue that the school district had. And so then half of that 481,000 plus the.
Yeah, but I remember asking you that question about that 310,000 and about is that going to go back? And you told me at that time it was no, because it was never part of the discussion. But I see it, and Bjarke and I talked about that, and I went over to ask you that same question, and that was not going to be part of it. And then I see $791,000 turned back, I said, wow. I said, they melted more than what I was trying to get.
I'm not sure what to tell you. That was always the case.
As you can see,
using the three
what it's
tests.
costing you this year, you would basically would be trouble-free almost if you didn't have hadn't turned that $791,000 back to the taxpayer, and you kept it for buildings, because, am I correct in facilities, there's a 4.8% decrease, so does that mean there's nothing going to get done to any facilities this year?
Part of that decrease is the $50,000 in savings from the
Correct,
fuel.
but the question I'm asking is there any buildings going to get taken care of with any upgrades this year? Is there money in the budget for upgrade for facilities?
We're not doing this year we're not doing any major renovations through the budget, no. That's something that we're trying to pull out and use in capital reserve funds because it's really difficult. All of our schools did a little bit differently. So last year, a lot of our districts dumped money into their budgets from basically cleared out their ed reserves.
Yeah, sure.
And tried to do projects in all their schools. At UD3, the pattern was really seeing how much money they had left at the end of the year and then taking that fund balance and using it to fund their projects. And so we're trying to be a little bit more clear to say, okay, here are the projects that we want to do. Let's pull these out, use capital reserve funds. And so our budget is actually the operating costs of our schools as opposed to these renovations that may require a little more input from either the general public or the board itself.
Leonard, are you asking about FY18 or this budget for next year?
This budget coming for next year.
Okay, so you were answering for this year, right?
No, he was answering
For it in general.
next year.
Look at this budget here.
Yeah, so that's not reflected in what you're seeing on the paper yet, Leonard. That's sort of something that we had to wait to see how this all played out, and then in the January draft, there'll be some separate line items for capital reserves that are off the general fund budget.
But I hope you can see as a board that how that stuff come back to haunt you. Because $791,000, you folks, they had to actually find this year out of the budget to put towards what you kept out last year. We turned the order, so now you're looking for $791,000 this year. And so far, if the state does their job, the way they got it now, you're only having to come up with $200,000. I just think it's the wrong way to go in the future. The few dollars you give back to the taxpayers, you need to keep that for your building because every school needs money put into it every year. Thank you.
We would like to keep it to questions still, and we can move to comments after. Were there further informational questions? Yes.
Laura Cermele from Middlebury. Could you explain the thinking around paraprofessionals, especially the staffing cut that we were looking at for Mary Hogan, which maybe has changed by now, but what is the thinking about how to use paraprofessionals?
So
that's changing.
So one thing is we have a big change from last meeting to this meeting. So we had a total of 18 reductions and we moved to 8. So we've added back 10 positions to Mary Hogan in this draft. So that's one change. In terms of what the model looks like, it's something that we've been talking about for a long time, but we haven't really, it's part of what I showed earlier in terms of an inclusionary model and tying it into what is our systematic role what is our system that we're going to use across all of our schools in terms of supporting students. We have cultures that have developed in all of our schools and those, in terms of paraprofessional use, which aren't necessarily grounded in an approach that we've decided this is the approach we're going to use. That's the work that we need to do. That when we look at the ratios and look at the paraprofessional load at Mary Hogan versus other schools, it's significantly higher, which is why we look there to pretty much equalize as we look through ratios for everything. So we didn't look just at paraprofessionals, we were looking at teachers and other staff as well. I think the challenge we're in is we're getting lots of information both from the state and elsewhere to say that we need to look at how we use paraprofessionals in the classroom and be really directed about it. So that's information that we're getting. I mean, Secretary Holcomb sent out a memo last week with
the findings from the district management group, which did a study of 10 different districts in Vermont, and their conclusion was that paraprofessional use was really varied and wasn't directed enough at times when students needed really specialized instruction. So it's something that we feel like we need to talk about, we need to research it, we need to look at it, and we need to figure out what works for ACSD.
Bjarke.
So just a question, I guess, just about the kind of changes and reductions along the way. One thing I did, and I promise this first part will be quick, and it will lead to a question, I promise. One thing I was struck by last week was I do think you had a great response last week in terms from people, and I understand you get that. And it was very focused on Mary Hogan, which I think was important. There was a big cut there, right? But I also realized, I think, last week that part of the reason that happened was that was the identifiable cut. When you looked at Mary Hogan, you could say, okay, that's where it's coming from. It's from classroom paras. Everywhere else, it's kind of vague. You didn't know where principals were coming from. You didn't know what classroom teachers at MUMS in the high school and things like that. So, I do think there's a little bit of awareness that makes you go, oh no, that's a situation, which maybe I think skewed the Mary Hogan thing a little bit. So my question is here with staff reductions, now that we've gotten that money back, thank goodness, principals, that 100% has been reinserted back in the budget. Central office, 50% has been reinserted back in the budget. The one I'm looking at, to be totally honest, is MUMS. And I'm not a MUMS teacher, for those thinking about it. And my wife is an Indian. So you're talking about now 40% being put back in compared to that 50 or 100%. I think for clarity, it would be interesting to hear, because at MUMS, you don't have a ton of staff. You have a certain number of teams. You have a certain number of cores there. Do we have any clarity there, similar to the clarity we had about Mary Hogan, about things at MUMS or the high school? So that people can respond about their own
So
children's
what's guiding the reductions is, when we started out this process, we thought about, okay, how do we do this without having this seem like some subjective practice, where we talk to different buildings or administrators and say, what do you feel like you can cut? Which it doesn't lead very far, right? It's challenging to be equitable in that kind of situation. So we started with looking at ratios as at least a starting point. And we don't think ratios are the end all and be all, that we can live strictly by ratios. But we felt like, in terms of taking a step, that we had to use that as some kind of basis. And so looking at the slide I showed you and looking at the data, our staffing at MUMS is higher than most of our schools in terms of comparing licensed teachers to students. So that's what's driving the decision making, is looking at that. When we did our initial ratio overview and looked at all the different positions, the numbers, if you brought up all of our schools to Mary Hogan's licensed staff, you would be cutting a lot of teachers at the middle school and the high school, much more than even the initial 5 and 6. And typically, elementary are staffed lower than middle school and high school. So that's how we started there.
So I understand that, but at MUMS, I think it's even a little different than the high school, because MUMS, you have a certain number of teams and a certain number of cores within that team. So you can say, yeah, we divide people, but we know it doesn't totally work that way.
I need to do questions first, and there are a few
That's
other
a
hands
question.
up.
I'm asking, what's that look like?
What does what look like?
Well, how do you deal with the fact that you need to keep the same number of cores and the same number of teams? Do MUMS people know that?
Yep.
So I have a question. I work at MUMS. I'm Jennifer Billings, and I teach at MUMS and teach math. And my question's when Bjarke's talking, it made me think about equitable, and you're talking about equity amongst the buildings. And I'm looking at, like at Mary Hogan, they have some great programs, the Success Center, the Gifted and Talented program, Autism program. And then at Mom's, there's no program? Oh, I heard there was, so I stand corrected. I stand corrected. Because I know at our building, we have lost like any little special programs that we have. And I want to know, when we get to the high school, they have DO and they have all ed, and we have so many students in our building that need alternative education. They really do. And I want to know, how is it going to be equitable for the kids at MUMS to access an alternative program? Because I can't even imagine our building with 3 less teachers, because we are all out straight every day. And I think about that, and I think about how is that equitable for those kids. That population of students is so volatile because they're adolescents, they're hormonal, they're going through puberty, and we're trying to educate them. And the thing is, I just think about that equity piece. And it's really, I feel like it's not equitable for the middle school students. And how can we fix that problem? Is that part of the master plan?
Are you talking about this specific master plan or metaphor?
I'm talking about what you have up on the board about inclusive education and looking at creating a plan and looking at academic and behavioral interventions. And that's what I want to know, what's available to be equitable for our students.
I mean, I think that's something that your principal and your staff are working on together to figure out how does that best work. You know, and everyone has the same issue of limited staffing. I mean, I think you have to decide as I think it really, again, falls to the building leader to decide, we can sustain this much staffing, how do we best use it? And I don't claim to know enough about what happens at MUMS. I much rather entrust that to Chris and the staff at MUMS to talk about that, to figure out how can we best support all kids with the staffing that we can sustain. And I think I think that's true in probably a lot of buildings, that they're looking at the needs of all sorts of different kinds of learners and trying to figure out how do we do it with this amount of staffing. And it's not always easy, but I think it's where we are.
Yes, over here.
Maria Graham. And so my question is, can't we as a community decide that we don't agree with that level of staffing at the middle school? Because we talk so much about equity, and the first time our kids get a chance at a truly equitable education is in 7th grade as a district, and in 8th grade. And in 2 years, those teachers and those administrators get all of those kids to see each other as a team and then send them to the high school. And I'm just getting to the high school with my own kids. But I was very upset about the Mary Hogan cuts, but I actually think that those middle school cuts could have a bigger impact on our kids as they go through and as they graduate. So can't we as a community say, we don't agree with that level of funding you want to give to Chris? That's my question. Where do we have a say in that?
Ultimately, the budget goes before the community.
Yeah. So, I just want to add to that, Maria, and yes, ultimately, all of our voters get to decide whether they like the budget or not and approve the budget, or not approve the budget, and come to meetings and say why you didn't vote for it. But I can tell you there's radically different opinions on what we should and shouldn't do based on everybody's priorities, and we heard a lot of that in the surveys. The decline in enrollment that we're seeing at the high school with the largest class leaving our district, that 12th grade class, we are trying to adjust for that loss of actual students, like physical students. Those students left MUMS 4 years ago, and there was not any change in the staffing level at MUMS then. And now this year, there's going to be 30 fewer, or next year, there'll be 30 fewer students at MUMS. So Mums is actually, on a per pupil basis, our most expensive school, far more expensive than any of our tiny elementary schools. So, you know, when we're looking at equity across the district and where do we put resources, we have to use some measures, and ratios is one thing that we tried to use, and we adjusted those ratios quite a bit as we looked at those ratios in the finance committee. We also have to look at per pupil spending, like how much are we spending on our middle school versus our high school versus our elementary schools.
And versus all the different elementary schools.
Right, and we're,
Excuse me, we're asking questions and getting answers.
So that's one of the things that we looked at. And, you know, I hear you about the challenges that may happen at MUMS. I also think that MUMS is an incredibly resilient school, and I've been incredibly impressed with the people at MUMS and the staff at MUMS. You guys have some of the best teachers in the district, hands down, and I know that you can do it. And so I think that sort of feeling of like, we are an awesome team, and we've got fewer students, and how can we best use our awesome team to meet the needs of those students? And we're not reducing the special education budget, which is some of what you're talking about with the terms of the high need students at once.
Yes. I'm trying to call on people who haven't had a chance to speak yet.
When you were doing the ratios for the high school, did you include the percentage of students who are away at the Career Center at any given time in those ratios?
The Career Center students
did,
were,
yeah.
were included in the ratios.
No,
they were not included.
They were not. Okay.
They're not included because they're counted by the Career Center. So and it's portions of students, right?
Right.
So it's like 0.2, 0.3, so all that added up, I think, was 54.
54.
Yeah.
Something like that.
54.
Yeah.
And the second question is, as we're moving more to IB, we are still funding by middle school versus high school, yet MYP is 710. Will there be a move towards budgeting and looking at the budget more within those models than a school-by-school basis?
I think actually that's what we're trying to do as we're looking at our budget holistically and not being like, okay, this is the Weybridge budget, this is the Bridport budget, this is the Middlebury budget. We are trying to sort of use this budget to equalize some of the what I called last week, these sort of inherited budgeted practices that we inherited from all the different boards, and we inherited a lot of great stuff, and then we inherited some problems that we need to fix. And so that's what our attempt is this time, and I think we're trying really hard to look at things holistically, so it's not an us versus them, a high school versus middle school versus elementary school, or community versus community, or kind of child versus kind of child. I mean, that's the most disturbing, I think.
So does that mean that the middle school could start accessing some of the alternative programs that are accessed by other MYP students, but are currently housed at the high school, as we talk about those equity issues? That maybe we access differently what we have?
Potentially, I mean, it depends on what the program is. And Bill, anything to add there?
No, you sure you want to have?
I'd like, we're kind of getting a field of the budget and the numbers, and that's in an area that the board doesn't really get involved in, so I'd like to continue with more of the board stuff. Yes, and back, please.
Hi, Dave Joe from Middlebury. First, I want to say thanks for all the work you guys are doing. I haven't heard anyone say that yet, so thank you.
Thank you.
Second, I just wanted to ask if and when there's more information available about all this, because this is really high level, and at least for me, I'm a nuts and bolts kind of guy. I want to know how many, I don't want to know equivalent students, I know that's important to you guys, what equivalent pupils. I want to know how many kids are actually in classrooms, especially in the elementary school.
So last year, we put together, mostly Josh put together, this really awesome annual report and budget book. And we will have another one of those, and it had much more detail in line items and much more detail in school by school and much more detail in types of programs and types of budgets. And that's the goal this year, is to do that again. And we'll see a first draft of that on January 2nd. Is that what you're talking about?
That's great, and may I just request that on top of the equivalent pupils, you actually provide actual enrollment in classroom sizes and that kind of stuff?
So
I'm really interested in like the number of able bodies in a classroom per student, in fact, like rather than the equivalent pupils and the equivalent this and that.
So in the packet that you're holding there, I believe, is it still in this week? Last week's packet, we had some of that information, and it was based on actual enrollment, so like one-to-one, like a one meant actually one, you know what I mean? It was non-weighted enrollment. So that was provided last week. Is it on the website somewhere? It's on our website, so you can look at that and get a somewhat of an idea. And I believe the budget book will have both equalized pupil and enrollment numbers.
So nuts and bolts, stay tuned.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Wes?
Thank you.
This is question, not a comment. Peter.
Yeah, you gotta speak, you gotta be more specific.
Pardon me?
You gotta be more specific.
As we begin to change the structures in our schools and change the structures of financing, I'm curious about the $445,000 that come from Title I. What percentage of those funds are allocated to IB in comparison to direct student support services in the various schools?
None right now.
None to IB? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. And then the other question I have, and excuse my ignorance on this, is per pupil costs. Per pupil costs, for instance, at Mary Hogan are about $15,000, $14,000 and change. How does that translate to equalized student spending? Equalized student costs, which are $17,000. So, on a level funded budget, how does that translate?
So, do you want to take a stab at that?
I don't know that they really do translate. I mean, one is looking at, you're
So
looking
are
at a
they
school.
apples and oranges?
They're apples and oranges, because you're looking at the school cost and dividing it by enrollment, for example. So if you took last year's budget book and said, okay, ID4 had, $5 million and it was 494 students, and that's an enrollment cost per enrolled student. The 17,216 that we have for this year is all of our costs and all of our equalized pupils. So they're not really the same figures.
So in the book that you were suggesting to the gentleman that was inquiring earlier, that's where we'll find that information?
So,
The per pupil cost?
Per pupil cost by building or by school? So the state provides us an equalized pupil number for our entire district and doesn't divvy it up by school. So it would be a kind of a difficult project for Josh to try to figure out how many equalized pupils are in each of our schools. It used to be divvied up by, because we're all separate districts, and it's not anymore, we're one district. We know enrollments by building, but we don't necessarily have easy access to equalized pupils per building. So the budget book will have the overall equalized pupil, which in this draft is, spending per pupil is around
17.
Yeah, sorry, I had to. But it won't have it by building.
So it's not easily accessed, so the question is, can it be accessed?
So, that's what I was going to just mention is, once we unified, we can't really accurately tell you exactly what the cost per pupil is at each school. So last year, when we had our first unified budget, we did break out by school, and that was just to provide information to show you how much it was costing. But the old way we did it, where we would fund an employee, like in 3 different schools, a central office employee, and that funding would then come back, and that's no longer possible to do in the way that we used to. So we can get a general view, and we can look generally at staffing, for example, as one metric, or supplies, et cetera, as
adding up all those pieces. But to get the total number, we can't access it anymore. And because we're getting that equalized pupil from the state at a district number, we can't break that out. And Josh mentioned how wonky it is in terms of trying to figure out even what that is. As happened to us this year with our, drop, up, who knows what's going to happen next.
So in the wonkiness of it all, quote, if in fact the students at Mary Hogan last year, the average expenditure was 14 and change, correct?
So the last year that there was an ID4 standalone budget, it was about 2 years ago, and it was about $14,495 per equalized pupil.
Okay, yeah, so 14 and change. So this is when we get into the individual schools versus we are one happy community working together for the benefit of us all. When we look at other institutions, some are higher and low, and some are lower. So, how does that translate in this budget? Will the schools with the higher per pupil cost maintain that cost so as to run their schools in an efficient manner? Or will the schools with lesser per student costs have their costs increased to have an equalized opportunity?
Our decisions around where the reductions come from, primarily using the ratios and also looking at our scale, I think one thing we need to realize, and something that we have realized, is that there is no way, in terms of economy of scale, there's no way to staff our non-Mary Hogan elementaries, our 6 other elementaries, in the same way that we staff Mary Hogan. There's just no way to do it. And so that's who we are. And I think at some point, I think at some point we need to say, at least right now, that's who we are. And we can talk about leveling up or down or whatever, but because Mary Hogan has 3 to 4 classes per grade level, and you look even in the blending that we're proposing in 3 of our elementaries, those numbers are getting higher too. There's really no way, unless we cross that threshold of 3, a blended class of 3, which I don't feel good about, and I don't feel like I could support that. So that's kind of where we are. We're not looking at what is the cost per pupil in one school versus another school, and let's make sure everyone is at the same level. But we're more trying to look at what are our staffing patterns overall in all of our schools, and how do we make sure with the funding that we do have, how do we accurately staff to support kids.
So just a matter of time here, maybe 2 more questions, an opportunity if people just want to make some comments briefly, and then we will finish up as a board. So I'll take way back there, yes? Yeah, you.
Tanya Scuteri-Shoreham. I was wondering at the elementary level if you've identified ideal class sizes and maximum class sizes, and then on the maximum end of it, does that number change if it's a blended class?
So we have a class size policy, which is required, and then we have procedures that go along with it. So the minimum and maximum are different based on grade level, et cetera. And the maximum is a recommended maximum, so it's not like a hard and fast, and the minimum is a recommended minimum, but it's not hard and fast. And it's one thing that honestly the state has talked about for years. The legislation was put in place to force districts to adhere to specific class sizes, but there's enough flexibility in it that it's used primarily as a guide.
So
in terms of the blended classrooms, we looked at class sizes, and we looked across at all of our other schools too. We looked at blended classes of 20 or fewer, that we felt like we didn't want to go over 20 for a blended classroom. So that's how we got to the recommendations that we did.
Okay, and then just a quick follow-up question. So looking forward for Shoreham, within 2 or 3 years, our blended classes way upwards over 30. So I just wonder, when you're looking at cutting a full-time position, are you realizing that in 2 years you're gonna have to hire back to stay under that 20 per class?
And it's a year, yearly, we have to look at that projected enrollment to figure out what we're doing. One of the things that we've done, I think over many years, is we've used equalized pupil as a way to budget, and we're really not budgeting for the students that are coming into the classroom. So what we are trying to do, we're starting that process now and we'll continue it, is looking at what's the enrollment and how do we respond to that. We also, Josh mentioned the contingency we have in our budget as well. Sometimes in August, you get a number of families move into town and it spikes the class where it's really not, it's untenable to keep it in one class. So we do have that contingency line to if we needed to add a position, we could, if there was an emergency and the numbers went, too high.
And yes, one more. No, it's you, Mark.
Mark Mooney in Middlebury. So I have a comment and maybe a question included in that. I would maintain that the effort last year the board made and the administration made to bring the 6th grade to MUMS has had an impact on our decision-making this year. I thought, frankly, that was a very wise move, both educationally, financially, and for stability in the long term. And obviously, there was enough feedback. I'm not sure that represented the entire number of taxpayers throughout the district, including Middlebury, as to if that was not a wise move. So I understand the caution in dealing with Mary Hogan and the smaller schools, but I thought we were on a track because I think the rules changed when you formed the new district. Now, in the years past, it took Shoreham 12 years to decide to come to the high school. It took Bridport nearly 50 years to bring 7 and 8 here. So I'm sure hoping we're going to get on a track that is much faster. Now, as far as disaggregating figures, I requested and already have a response on the IB, but I noticed the administration ratio in the handout was like 102 to 1. But I can clearly do the math. Mary Hogan, MUMS, and Middlebury Union High School over 200. Maybe not MUMS, they may be less than 200 of administrators to students. All the others are under 100. And then I noted that you're delaying the decision on administrators in the outlying districts to another year. Now, I understand that that is a complex issue and how to manage those schools with, say, 3 principals versus 6, or whatever the current number is. But I think we have to move in that direction to get to equity, sustainability, and long-term financial fairness. Because the question asked over here, I would maintain currently that the per pupil cost is being subsidized by Middlebury taxpayers. Clearly, because the 17,000 versus the 14,000, I think you can disaggregate enough of that to see there's a difference per pupil cost, so that as long as that goes on, I just think with the big term of equity and fairness, that we need to address that at a much more aggressive or assertive manner. Thank you.
All right, since that was not a question, but we will move into the opportunity for some public comment. And again, we have another 2 meetings in January. The process will continue. We will be getting our nuts and bolts book in a couple weeks' time. But we didn't have the opportunity for basic public comment as we did before or after the information. And so I'd like to move into that phase of things. It's our chance to just listen and to hear what you have to say, given the information. Yes.
I do have a question.
Okay, maybe we can.
I'll trade this.
I'm Fran Putnam, and my question is about this whole question about the principals, and my question is, how will that be decided? Who makes that decision? If the board decides that you're going to have only three principals for 6 schools, how will that be allocated? That's my question.
Right,
Who's
so-
going to make that decision? Is it
It would be the administration,
superintendent
yes.
or the board?
No,
or-
it's the administration, the superintendent, excuse me, yes. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Mike Sasson in Middlebury. I'm a former special educator at Mary Hogan. I'm a board certified behavior analyst, so I was one of the people that you see up there who gets called in to work with the kids that get to the tier 2, tier 3 places. And I want to talk about the kids of tier 1, the kids that don't need people like me, but who will need people like me if you continue to look at people in a building by numbers instead of by individuals. So I just want to take really brief, I want to tell you a little story about what I've seen. I've worked for community mental health. I'm currently in private practice, so I keep my both feet in the mental and behavioral health world. And what I've seen in schools that do it well, for kids who are tier 1, these are general education students, who sometimes come unprepared to learn. Be it because they didn't get breakfast that morning, maybe they only have grandma at home in the morning who's trying to get them and their brothers and their sisters to school on time. So they're not prepared to learn. They come into the classroom, and when there's more than just one adult in the room, you can take care of that kid. You can help aid their social emotional development. Without that, you're asking them to learn. Social emotionally, they're not ready. You need people to help with that. Now, I'm not saying that you have to have 2 paraprofessionals in every classroom. I don't know. I mean, you guys have a hard job trying to figure that out. I just want you to remember that when we're talking about kids, and we're talking about what makes them good citizens later on, it's not just about learning to write a great essay. It's not just learning to do algebra in 7th grade. It's about being socially and emotionally developed so that they can pass on the caring that they've received. And unfortunately, we live in a world where public school is the new hub for mental and behavioral health. That's just the truth. And it costs a lot of money. We live in a state that defunded a lot of institutions and provides for that to come from the community. School is the community. So we have to be careful when we start to remove people, because if you have 15 kids in a classroom and one of them comes unprepared to learn that day, you only have a teacher to help with that, well then that means nobody else can learn that day. Because the teacher has to take care of that kid, they have to nurture that kid. And if there aren't enough people in the building to do that, everybody suffers. And as a father I have a daughter who's going to be starting kindergarten next year at Mary Hogan, and I have a son who, God bless him, he's a maniac. He's 2 years old, and he is going to be that kid who needs a little bit of extra. And I'm a professional, but I don't know how to deal with them. Right? So let's just remember, when we're talking about money, I get it, I'm a business owner. I have to look at budgets too. That we're really talking about kids and we're talking about people. People make the biggest impact on children. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, Colleen Ringhurst. I have a number of comments, I guess. The first one goes back to the classroom teacher group and to pupil ratio. And my request is when that annual report comes out that has the actual classroom to teacher, that we make sure that that's really actual classroom teachers per student. We have a number of staff members here in the district who provide district-wide or school support, technology, curriculum, IB, implementation, all really necessary, valuable positions. They're in the budget under the teacher contract. And so I just want to make sure that requesting that they're not counted when those ratios are put into that annual report.
So, and I know that wasn't a question, but the slide that we showed you earlier with the ratios, that was actual classroom teacher per actual pupil. in a slide that I think was in Peter's presentation at the
Right,
beginning.
none of
So
the
that,
other-
we had the same concern, that we were actually talking about class sizes, not every single licensed person in the building, so yes.
Right,
Yeah.
all right. It looked a little low to me, but maybe that's because I'm in the mouth.
We can talk about it.
That's okay. The other piece of it, 50 less students at the high school, so less teachers. I think it's important to recognize that, 50 kids doesn't translate into 2 nice sections that you just, cut. Those 50 kids will come in dribs and drabs. It'll be 10 Algebra 1 students and, 15 geometry. And so you may be looking at a group of, currently, we've got 2 Algebra 1 classes going on. There's 44 kids. You lose 10. That's 34. Oh, so now you're going to run 1 of 34? Or you're going to keep it 2 and go to 17. So it's just not as nice and neat always as it sounds. Secondly, as we phase out our current model and transition to IB, we're going to need to run parallel programs for a bit. We have a responsibility to our current 10 through 12th graders to let them finish the 4-year plans that they've started. And so, and to institute the IB courses for the current freshmen and kids that are coming in from now on. So 2 parallel programs potentially means more sections being offered of different classes, and probably smaller ones because, again, we're going to have to run parallel. So it may actually require more sections than fewer. And then there are additional requirements that come with IB, the community service project, the theory of knowledge, those things have to be managed. There's an individual project requirement for each student in each IB course. Whether they go for the IB diploma or not, they're required to do a 6 to 12 page project paper. Teachers have to meet with them, give them guidance, feedback, and grade those. That's a new piece, as well as setting up mock exams that they suggest, things like that. So, even though we're losing some students, I think we're gaining some responsibilities in other areas. So, it all takes time. I mean, we can do IB, we can do it well. There's a difference between those two. And, if we level fund, you still cut $600,000 from the budget.
Thank you. Yes, back.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Carl, I'm from Bridgeport. I realized after seeing this tonight that we've changed our 1.6 principal to going in 2020. But I just want to say that Bridgeport was the test subject of having no principal in the building for a year, 2 or 3 years ago, and it does not work. It does not work. Talk to the teachers. The teachers were miserable that year. They had no one to go to. The parents would go in the building to speak to an administrator about something that happened on the bus or something going on in the classroom, and there was nobody there to talk to some days. There was a principal one day, a totally different principal the next day. They had no idea what happened on Monday. The principal on Tuesday had no idea what happened on Monday. So it would take till Friday to maybe get someone to answer your questions. It does not work. And so I am encouraging the board to rethink that. No school, no student, no family member, no taxpayer wants their school to not have, or deserve their school not to have a full-time administrator there. It is grossly negligent to leave a school without a principal, with the teachers trying to teach and dealing with all the disciplinary actions. It is absolutely irresponsible.
Thank you. Yes.
Steve Flint, I'm a teacher at Mary Hogan. Come from a
pretty unique background in that I started as a paraeducator, classroom teacher, assistant principal, board member. I'm a specialist area teacher now. I've done kind of a lot of different roles in my career so far, and it's not lost on me, especially from the board member perspective and administrator perspective. This is like emotional warfare. I mean, yesterday morning you got in here like it's doom and gloom, and now you're like, all right, we're good again, right? The consequence to that, kind of like that up now, is like feeling okay. We're only like 1 decimal point away from being back down again, or that $455,000 in Title I funds. In the federal budget, the proposed federal budget has $0 in Title I funds, so we could potentially be back in that spot, right? So I'm not saying that to kind of rain on your parade, but I do want to, I guess, kind of urge you, if we do get to that spot again, to be mindful of the totality of our student services. So don't distill, groups down to like ratios and isolation. So I'll give you an example. So when I first saw, the cuts last week and even now, it reminded me of the work of Michael Jane Greco. So he's a UVM education research person, did a lot around paraeducators. And we can debate the merits about some of his claims about whether we should reduce them or not reduce them. But one of his findings was, if you do, there are going to be huge voids, and they have to be replaced with something. Whether it's a special educator, SOP, those services cannot be left as a void. And so, if we do get to that spot where, we have to oh my gosh, we have another $500,000 we need to find now, I would ask that you look at the totality of student services, not just paraeducator ratios. Look at paraeducator ratios with special educators, with SOPs. Look at the totality of what we are offering to our students, not just isolated ratios, because that can get really tricky. Maybe not really the full picture. So, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, in back.
Hi, I'm Laura Federoff, I'm from Cornwall, and I just want to echo the sentiments of the lady from Bridgeport. I think that our school principals are incredibly important to our day-to-day workings of our schools. You don't know how hard she works, and I really feel like cutting them would be a really bad idea. Just in case you're using this as taking a temperature of the room, the temperature of the communities, I'd like to stand up and say, please don't take our principal.
Thank you, Laura. Yes. Nope.
Hi.
Hi, Sarah. Yeah.
I'm Dina Greenman from Cornwall also. I just had a quick comment. I've heard pretty much all different voices tonight saying, don't make cuts to the middle school, don't make cuts to the high school, don't make cuts to the elementary schools, keep our principals. I want to keep them all. I mean, my kids are in Cornwall, they're in middle school, they're going to be in the high school. We can't, right? You guys are telling us we can't. So we either have to trust in these guys, they're going to take our feedback and do the best they can, and trust in our superintendent, whose own children are in this district, and trust in our reps. Otherwise, what are we supposed to do? We can't keep everything. So we all have to do a little bit of deep thinking that we are now a district, and maybe Middlebury does have to send a little bit of money out to the other schools until we're ready to say, let's combine our elementary schools, which nobody wants to say. There's no other efficiencies that I can imagine that'll make everybody in this room happy. I mean, just a shout out to Jen Crowd, it's like she's the best principal ever. But I mean, we can't keep everybody. I mean, my daughter at Mom's is like as happy as can be, but I do have faith, I'm echoing what Ruth said, that they're gonna figure it out. I mean, maybe we can have a principal panel sometime that's gonna say, all right, this is how we can creatively work with what we're given, and these are the solutions we're working on, and maybe already they have ideas for how we're gonna maybe not have teams at Mom's in the same way, but it's gonna be even better because of IB. I don't know, but we can't all have everything we want, and it's just too bad because that's the way our culture is, unfortunately, or we won't do it. I don't know. I was a teacher for 7 years, I get it. And I worked in a district where we had a lot less money and a lot bigger classes, so we are still lucky, I really believe that. And we have good leadership, and these people are working really, really, really hard, and I'm so glad I'm not on this board. Anyway, so thank you for your work and everybody's comments for being here, but I don't know what the solution is, honestly.
Two more. Yes, and back.
Hi, I'm Julie Barrett. I have two kids in the elementary schools. I think I'd kind of like to maybe build on what was said right in this area, in a little rows here. In thinking about the leadership model for our elementary schools, for all of our elementary schools, I've been working hard to picture my two kids in each of our schools, to try to consider where we would be, no matter what school my kids attended, which is a great exercise. It's actually a lot easier to think about that than to think about my kindergartner in this building. But I think that when we're talking about shifting our principalship model, I'm grateful maybe there's maybe a year built into how this could go if this budget goes the way it does. Because I think that a shift from a full-time principal to a part-time principal is dramatic in a lot of ways and impacts the relationships, like you spoke to, and impacts a lot of the practicalities and shifts responsibilities on teachers. But it also shifts the leadership model, I think. And it shifts the model from a model of leadership to a model of managing, which is a whole different thing. If you have two part-time people coming into your building, it's not leadership in the same way, and it could leave the school very rudderless, basically. And a rudderless school would be miserable, I think, for anybody, for all of us, no matter where you are in the district. But I think it also feels a little bit crummy in that we'd be setting them up for that. And setting people up to feel rudderless, to me, feels like a backdoor way to get a school closure. And a backdoor way to get a school closure feels really crummy. And if we're going to talk about that, I would love to do what Peter Burrows had mentioned earlier, and have those difficult conversations in a thoughtful way, in a reflective way, in a way where we have a little bit of time built into what we want our school leadership to look like and what we want our schools to look like. And the fact that we haven't gone there, I think, is concerning to me. And the other piece that hasn't come up, I heard Ruth mention earlier, we're looking at facilities and grade configurations, and the one thing that didn't come up was where we send our students, and whether or not, now that we're a unified district, we want to consider being flexible with town boundaries and school boundaries, and why we're not talking about that is something that I wonder about as well. Maybe that's the question.
We are. The answer to your question is we are.
So could you elaborate on that?
Sure. At a certain point, we have a policy committee that works on policy, and one of the policies that they will be discussing is a school boundary policy.
And will that come to the community in some way?
I don't think we've gotten that far yet, but yeah, I think we would.
It seems to me like that was sort of, would feed really naturally into the master plan that you were referencing.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So the three of you have had a chance to speak. If it's really pressing, we'll try to make it very quick, and then we need to get on to our board conversation. Go ahead, Wes.
I don't want to reiterate what has been said already, but in regards to paraprofessionals and their need in the classroom, but I would like to offer an alternative thought. Paraprofessionals work with both the most needy, emotional, dysregulated children in the school, but in addition, they also support teachers, and they support other students who might need assistance when the student they are supporting does not need that service. We currently, at Mary Hogan School, and my background is mental health. So I've been in the business for a long time, but I started in mental health, had to find a real job after Reagan pulled the rug out from under mental health years ago, and went to education. I understand the dilemmas that mental health groups are in regards to funding. But given the situation that we're currently in here, in this district, I would like to offer this. Mary Hogan contracts with the Counseling Service of Addison County for $200,000. For that $200,000, we've received the support of behavioral interventionists as well as their supervision. The behavioral interventionists are responsible for the needs of the student that they support, and only the student that they support. They are not available to support, based upon their contract, as I understand it, to support other children in the school or in the classroom in which they reside if in fact they should experience difficulties. Paraprofessionals have a much more heterogeneous role in that they can support all students. Given the lack of funds that we're currently looking at, I would offer that we revisit that contract and we assess whether it is meeting the needs of all of our students in, I'm speaking specifically of Mary Hogan, of all of our students in Mary Hogan, and might that money be better spent on reinstituting the paras that are going to be cut under the current budget.
Thank you. Bjarke, briefly, please.
Yeah, I'll be quick, and this is as a parent, actually, not as a person. Just real quickly, interesting question about merging schools. I've heard, actually, Dr. Burrows talk about this pretty eloquently. Or not merging, but moving around. One thing you just have to be careful of, it's not impossible, but that you're not allowing those who have needs who can get their kids to different schools to be able to do that, and those who can't have, subject their kids to a 55-minute bus ride when they're in fourth grade. But just to say, just a note about, we think sometimes about elementary schools as they get smaller, should we shutter them? Just as a parent of someone of a child who's been in a blended classroom for 2 years, I've done a lot of research to find out about it. And every bit of research I've found, for kindergarten it's a little different because they're very young, right, and they have different needs. But as you get older, there's actually incredible, real educational benefits actually to blended classes. I know for my son, it's been fantastic, and I think it's worked out great. And so I just wouldn't say that you just, oh no, classes are getting smaller, we always need to house them housed together. There could be arguments an entire school district should be blended classrooms. So just dismiss that all. And I know in Weybridge and Ripon they have it's worked well.
Final comment.
Hi, again, Jennifer Billings, a teacher at Moms. I just want to thank you for giving us a voice, but I really want to be a voice for the students. I am a math intervention teacher, and I have 46 students that, are 1 to 2 grade levels below in math. And I worry about, with the cuts, what's going to happen with those services, those kids that they don't get special ed, but programs like my math program and the reading intervention program, those type of programs are there for those kids to be successful and to get caught up in math. And we just finished a major community service project as part of the IB unit, and without the paraprofessionals, we couldn't have baked 56 dozen dog treats for the Humane Society. We couldn't have done it. I couldn't have done it without the 2 aides that I had, and especially the population of student that I have. So I just really want to be that voice for the students, for my students, because I see their struggles and I see what they go through, and I feel like their parents don't know how to advocate for them. So I will advocate for them. And we have to find a way to keep programs in place that are going to help students to continue to grow. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much. We will be reconvening on the 2nd of January. The board is now going to continue discussing this and provide direction for the administration. All right. So, we're going to take a 5-minute break. All right, we're back on camera, if that makes a difference to you all. So, board members, we have before us essentially a sort of a new track. And do we want to stay on this path? last meeting, we had a motion and a vote to use the term level funded as we had defined it. This is a deviation from that slightly. And I'm not sure we need to go through a whole motion and vote, but the question is do we want to continue and build the budget book off of this new deviation as explained tonight? And I guess if anybody has a strong thought here to entertain, yes, Perry, please start us out.
I just have a question.
Yes.
I missed the last meeting, and what information is coming in? Because a week ago, you got information yesterday.
Good question.
What's happening by January 2nd, our next meeting? What are the things that are going to drop out of the sky, or?
So we got, last week, we didn't have our equalized pupil count yet. That was supposed to come on Friday. It came over the weekend. That number, we were basing our projections on, last week, on a rollover of our equalized number, which we thought was more or less where we would land, based on what we were told last year about our pre-K equalized pupil and how that would, as Josh mentioned, that would equalize over 2 years. So we thought we might see a bump of 10 or maybe 15 tops. So we hadn't predicted this really big increase. To be honest, we're a little concerned that this is a preliminary number and the swing is so drastic. We did call again to say, and we shook Brad James and said, "Are you sure?" And he said, "Yes," right?
Until I changed my mind, right?
He pretty much said it's all subject to change.
We did not get a signature in blood, which is what I thought we should do.
Why is that?
Why
is it subject to change if they give you a number?
Preliminary, he doesn't have all the information. He just got the FY17, I think state play student count, so that's not included in that number. That shouldn't change anybody's number drastically, but it's just a slow, delayed release of information from all parties at all.
It's impossible to work with that kind of stuff.
It does almost make the argument to move school budget votes to another month because we were operating under this constant changing foundation. Yeah.
Typically, in my recollection, this number doesn't change. Once the state comes out with this number, that's the number that you use. I don't remember in the last 4 other budgets that I've been a part of that number
the
modulated.
number you did get was the way you've gotten it in the past? That is,
it hasn't been that much of a
changes.
It hasn't been that much of a swing.
Right.
But I think it's always announced as a preliminary number.
Yeah.
They reserve the right to revise.
It's not going to get
That's the difference. Yeah. Okay.
And then moving to the second, so I shouldn't say we, Josh is rolling up the budget into the budget book to present on the second.
Yep.
The draft of the budget book.
Yeah.
And preliminary numbers.
Subject to change.
That's right. So things we just received. So today we received our special ed grant information. So that includes the percentage of reimbursable costs that they will provide. It's the block grant, it's the extraordinary costs. So that's information we need to take because that affects our revenue side. And need to just sort of balance that on what we were projecting. So that we also got CLA today, which was an entire week early from last year.
But that can continue to change, right?
I don't think CLA changes.
Really?
No, CLA is from the state, it's from the tax department, I believe, and that's unless someone goes and what Waybridge did last year and argue the point. I think that was rare.
What changes is the yield rate.
Right. The legislature will be able to change the yield rate throughout the term.
Right.
And that has a drastic effect.
Further questions or comments? Yes, Jason.
What are we asking questions or comments on?
You may. What's that?
What are we specifically asking questions or comments on here? Do we have a motion or?
We do not have a motion. I'm not sure. We can go through the formality of a motion, or if there seems to be general consensus that we will continue along this path. So I guess, if people feel like we need to deviate from what has been put in front of us, it'd be a good time to speak. Yeah.
Then I do want to, so we passed the board voted last meeting to direct the administrators and the finance committee to present a level funded budget. Is the outline, the framework that's before us, do you consider that to be level funding? Or less than level funding?
It is slightly less than level funded, and we just, well, as you know, we just looked at it for the first time an hour before the board meeting. So I think there's wiggle room built into this version of it to ensure that we do hit level funding and that we could make adjustments in January when we have more information.
So I think it's important that we provide some measure of consistency and due process in how we do these things.
Okay.
So if we felt like it was necessary to pass a motion last time to direct a specific result and we're now deviating from that result, I don't think a sort of action by inaction is an appropriate follow-up to that. So if we feel like as a board we want to move now to a less than level funded budget, then I would ask that we consider a motion.
Okay.
So I would make the motion that we direct this administration to use the framework that we discussed tonight to bring to us another fuller draft on January 2nd. So maintaining this framework. Is that sufficient? I mean, I don't know that, because I don't want to say that it's like a certain percentage. It's the, let's use this framework with what, and see where that takes us till January 2nd when we have additional information. Is that sufficient?
Could you say that again? That we would, I move that we direct the administration to use the framework of the budget that we discussed tonight to put together the budget book, draft budget book for January 2nd.
The motion, Nick seconded. That was your hand going up to second, yes. All right, further comments to weigh in? Lorraine, you look like you have something you'd like.
Was the budget that we got last week actually level funded? You're saying this is a less than level funded budget. Was that a level funded budget?
That was presented last week?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
As we defined level funding.
Okay, so this is a less than level funded budget. The number was probably given, and I'm kind of moving it at this point. How much less than a level funded budget dollar-wise are we now?
Josh, anyone?
Is that based on equalized pupil?
That was how we defined it last week. Yeah.
So if equalized pupil, level fund by equalized pupil, if that is 17,200 or 17,015 for equalized pupil, which is what we went through tonight, we are currently at 16,809. So that's a difference of $200 per student, plus or minus.
140. Could you give that in terms of a raw number?
1,821.
200 per student gives us how many dollars?
That's $374,000.
$374,000 under level funding?
Yep.
Yes.
On a per pupil basis, which is what we used last week.
Yes.
So, as some of you have heard in the Finance Committee, and as some of you have heard in this, I have tried to be equitable, and I've tried to give on my position that teachers are important, and that we need to share the pain of this. But I don't see this as sharing the pain. I see the teachers bearing the burden and what's been presented to us, and that if we are going to go to a truly level funded, that the first thing that we should restore is adding teacher positions back in, because 50% of the central office was restored in this, 100% of the principal cuts were restored, 71% of the paraprofessional cuts at Mary Hogan were restored, and only 36% of the teacher cuts were restored. So if we're going to restore more money to this budget, I feel that it should come and adding 1 to 2 teachers back. My opinion.
Anything further?
Can I just speak?
Absolutely.
So I would advocate that we stick with the framework we have right now for now, because we just had this week where we had a massive change from one week to the next, and that when we look at the budget more completely in January, we'll have more information on us, sort of line by line stuff, we'll have more data, and then we can have the conversations of, do we want to add more back, or do we need to reduce in other areas, and have a more complete picture. If we change things now, we may have to change them again, and so just sort of waiting, since we just presented this to the whole community, so that we can be less of a yo-yo, is what I'm concerned about.
May I respond?
Yes.
In that sense, we asked for a level-funded budget. We're now finding out that it was below a level-funded budget. The cuts that were restored went, in my mind, disproportionately to other places than teachers. I'm just asking for that equity to be restored. In creating a level-funded budget, whatever funding out of that $355,000, which is the entirety of all 7 teachers, that at least it be restored to something like 50%, which I calculate to be 1 to 2 teachers added back in.
Lorraine?
I don't know if you can answer, or whoever can answer this, Bill or whoever. What Colleen mentioned about the number, not necessarily meaning, you can cut a teacher because there's 50 less kids or whatever. So I'm wondering if anybody can speak to whether you feel, whether you can tell whether those numbers do indicate that you can cut however many teachers without affecting those.
Well, Lorraine, the question will go to the superintendent.
Okay, well, whoever, Peter, Bill, whoever.
And if he chooses to defer to the principal, he may.
Is your question, is it what's your question?
Well, no, just what Steve just mentioned made me think of what Colleen brought up about, just because it's 50 students.
Right.
Doesn't necessarily automatically mean, we can cut 2 classes because it's 25 kids, when those students might actually be, dribbles and drabbles, I think is what she basically said. So
Yeah.
if you have a feeling for whether or not that is.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't equate in terms of how you staff a classroom. So if you lose 50 students, that spreads out differently. It could be, it could affect one department more than another department. It affects the school differently. When you have a school the size of MUHS, usually it can absorb some of those changes, and part of it too is looking at scheduling and figuring out how to give students a full schedule. Part of what the high school is going through right now is looking at new schedules as part of our move to International Baccalaureate. So that is a consideration that Bill has right now as he's looking at what next year looks like. Bill, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I would just say that in terms of that question, is I feel a lot better about what's been presented tonight than I did with what was presented a week ago, and recognizing that clearly our enrollment is going down, has gone down, and will go further down for next year. I'm much more comfortable with what has been presented tonight than where we were last week. There are some questions that are unknowns for me at the moment in terms of IB, but these numbers tonight are much more workable from my perspective than what we saw last time.
Yes, Chip.
Per that discussion, to me, it would make sense to stay where we are, and then as we get to this next with more data, because I certainly would want to know when we're trying to decide where we're going to put more teachers in, that if one of these high school teachers is going to require bigger two classrooms rather than cutting out an entire program. a small program, let's say, which could be the case. All right, if you have low enrollment in a certain program, that may be the easiest teacher to cut. So that to me is a very different issue than just deciding whether it's going to be just done on ratios. You know, that yes, you cut that teacher and you have more in a classroom, or you're going to, then I would be fighting, as Steve is, for not moving the teacher because we're going to lose a program. So I don't know. You haven't given us that yet, anyway, and whether you would or not, I don't know.
Well, and we haven't determined yet, you know, and that's something that I leave to principals. You know, once we get to an idea of where we're landing, that's when principals will then be communicating with staff members to talk about where we are. And some of these things aren't final until town meeting day either, so.
But when we're making decisions on budgets,
Yeah.
okay, as a board, even though we're not micromanaging, we still have a right to make it, have some part of our decision be as to the program itself, not just the number, period, I think, anyway. No, I'm making line there, I don't know where you draw it, but if you say, well, we're gonna cut out XYZ biology or whatever, I may have a real fight that I want to fight for that. No, but I think it's very different than just saying it's a certain number of teachers. I think it really relates much more. And as a board, I think we have a right to have some information on that, for sure.
Anybody who has, let me open up to anybody who hasn't had a chance to speak. Yes, Chris?
Yeah, I would just say that, I mean, for me, the last round, I was not very comfortable supporting. And it really was just more about looking at the numbers and thinking about the shock to the system and what I thought what we as a community would support for the education of the kids. And coming in and seeing the numbers that now we get to look at as basically a trick of counting or phantom students, which I'm grateful for. It puts us in a place where I'm much more comfortable in thinking that we can deliver what we need to do. So I'm supportive of where we're at. And again, this could all change with new numbers from the state next time around. And generally speaking, for me at least, I would still be, you know, whatever that might mean to our taxes or our staffing, you know, I would be more comfortable, I'm going to forecast myself in this area where we're at, where you've gotten us to. No matter what that looks like, I mean, subject to change, but, you know, I was asking for more, bumping it up last week, and now I'm happy where we are because I'm just trying to think of it from where we want to deliver education.
Thank you.
That's my feeling.
Anybody else before I go over to Jason? Go ahead.
The reason I raised this question is that we had a really lively conversation last week. A lot of people came. A lot of people have expressed thoughts since that time. And we made a statement as a board about a direction for our budget process. And the inputs have changed toward this week, and we're fortunate to be looking at maybe needing to cut less. I don't know why it made sense to present that in the terms of not within the framework of the motion that we passed last week. I'm assuming it was just trying to turn this around as fast as possible and get to where we got to. But it feels odd to me that we're a week in and dealing with so much change, and yet we're already now again talking about changing, moving the goalpost of what we're budgeting to again. Why not just continue under our previous motion, which was to build a budget toward a level funded platform? That's what Montpelier has requested of us. That's what we discussed last meeting and voted for last meeting. I just don't, like, great, yes, this is encouraging, right? And the fact that we're under what's being presented here is less drastic cuts and we're still under the level funding threshold means that we can continue to build our budget toward, hopefully next week if the numbers don't change, toward maybe continuing to build back in some of the things that are important. So it feels odd to me to be asking to change the framework again when we already had a conversation about this just a week ago and the board made a statement. And folks have responded to that and engaged with us on that. I think we can just leave it alone under the original motion and decline to pass a new motion and come back next week to review, okay, now that, we've got a picture where we're headed. What is the level funding budget going to look like in our first draft of the budget book with the numbers that we have at that point from the state? Since level funding is what we were asked to do, and level funding is what we said we'd do. That's why I'm putting this out there.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a clarifying question? So if we did nothing today and didn't do a motion, we wouldn't necessarily change what we have on this paper right now. We would just ask that the motion from last week would stand and that the draft budget that Josh prepares for us on January 2nd would be level funded per pupil.
I would hope that the first draft budget that we look at, that's a detailed draft budget, would be in line with the motion that we already passed, that as a board that we asked for, which is level funding.
We're basically add $385,000 back into the budget, in essence, from what we had proposed.
I mean, the room is there, and who knows, between now and then, the number might change again, and we might, $300,000 may magically disappear again.
Yeah.
But, like, why move the goalpost to fix us to a certain number now when we already set a standard? Like, I just don't understand why we want to change that again. When we had now two conversations around the idea of a level funded budget. And there was already some questions from the community around, well, wait a minute, this isn't level, you said you were doing level funding, but this isn't level funding. It's like, what? How many times? There are like 16 moving goalposts on like randomized pattern hoverboards from the state already. Like, why contribute to that as a board? I don't know.
Sorry.
Yeah, if you'd like to respond.
I guess what I don't want to do, and I understand your logic now better, which helps, but what I don't want to do is tonight rework this so it's level funded with the information we have now and say, oh, actually, we don't have to cut any teachers or we don't have to blah, blah, blah. And then to come back on January 2nd and be like, well, actually, we need to cut more teachers and have this yo-yo of not only our numbers, but people's mental health because they're worried. And so I think it's fair to stick with these numbers now and see where things change and how we can come back on January 2nd. And I think it's fair to say, we stay with our motion from last time. I would be fine with that, but not tonight rework this.
Yeah, I don't think it has to be. I mean, this is sort of a check-in along the way anyway, and this is new information. So, we gave direction for where we wanted to see a budget. Unless the board as a group thinks that level funding was too much, and we want to reduce to the level, because ultimately what we're passing is a dollars amount, essentially, right? Because when it comes right down to it, the administrators are going to spend that amount as they need to. We itemize it for the sake of trying to understand what's in it, but ultimately it gets spent how it gets spent based on the need. So, like, why constrain ourselves further than we already agreed to do in sort of that overall number? Let's leave the pre-existing motion as it is, and we know we're in a better spot now than we were. Hopefully it stays that way, and let's see a detailed draft budget in line with that original motion.
Chris, did you want to say something?
Yeah, and I don't really know that it applies here. I just know it applies at the end, which was at our very first meeting when we talked about this. We did vote to see what a level funded budget would look like, so we'd have a starting point. It was at no time the intention of that motion to say that this was what we were going to craft and somehow adhere to. It was what we tasked the committee with as a starting point. So whatever that means to me on this motion or not, at no point was that a vote in support of that being what the budget was going to be.
Anybody else?
What I don't want to see us do is if we suddenly say we're going to bring back even more money, that we decrease even more in the amount of, at least until we know the details, the number of teachers. Because this whole thing is equalized. The public looks at budget number, not the people that were here tonight, okay, but the greater public looks at a budget and teachers. And if you don't reduce teachers with a decreasing enrollment, there's something that just doesn't fit together. Now, you and I know it's much, much more complicated than that. However, I just don't want to see us get to the next time and say, okay, we can put all these teachers back in for not level funding and having this new math, so to speak, which is a great benefit, but I think it's a trap. I really do. I don't mean that it's wrong and they're going to change it, but it's a trap. Just can't go like that, even though we've tried to worry about it.
Nick?
One thing is certain, these numbers are going to change in the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, sure they are.
And I guess I kind of agree with Chris. We sort of picked level funding to say, hey, what's it look like? And we got a look at what it looks like. And now we're in a new place with new information. And for me, that requires new action. And my concern with saying, let's stick with the original level funded idea is that if we aren't disciplined in what we're proposing for cuts, we have a rolling student count, and we're going to be we're just postponing difficult decisions to another year. So I'm in support of the direction that we're headed. Anyway, so we have a motion on the floor. We have a second. We've had conversation. We'll go to a vote. All those in favor of the motion as presented, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
No.
No.
The ayes appear to have it, and the ayes do have it, and we've passionate. Were there any abstentions? I'm sorry, I forgot to ask.
I actually am abstaining because I'm still not quite sure what.
I'm not sure what motion we're voting on either, so I'm abstaining.
All right, so we're back way up the motion.
Yeah.
Well, just, I guess.
It was the original motion of staying with the framework that we presented to the public tonight
As
for
opposed
the
to the level
following, for the
funded.
draft that we see on January 2nd.
Yeah.
Not changing the parameters of this framework.
So if we want to stick with level funded, we say no, and if we want to adjust it so we're going below level funded, we say
Correct.
aye. Okay, got it. Thank you, sorry.
No, that's okay, it was complicated.
Holding us to anything at the next.
This is just build us a budget for the next meeting.
Yeah, for the next one.
Hold this to anything.
Doesn't, it just holds them to presenting what they're going to present to us next week.
2 weeks.
2 weeks, sorry.
Next week's off.
I'd really like to come back.
Next week's off.
It's a little crazy at my house at Christmas.
Vacation next week.
Christmas, yeah.
So no, this is not tying our hands, this is the budget we're going to present. It's just telling them, please come back with a budget book and framework that takes these numbers into account.
Point of order.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Since we had two members who had not voted, is it proper to re-vote on that motion?
I guess if the members would like it to have their vote, you have the, I think the right to change your vote, if you would like to change your vote.
Or actually,
Or abstain.
Can I ask one thing?
Yeah.
So the reason this budget was presented, you're the one who created this budget, correct?
Yeah.
Because you felt that these cuts can be done.
Based on where we started and based on where we are headed next year with enrollment, this seemed like a moderate, sustainable step.
So are we re-voting or what are we?
We are not re-voting. We are offering the opportunity to register a change of vote if anybody would like to do that.
Okay.
So are you calling them off on that? Is that what we're?
Excuse me?
Well, there's two members that didn't vote, is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah, I'm voting yes.
Okay.
And yes is to support what
the framework.
What Ruth
the
Word is out.
There was a voice vote and the voice vote carried it.
There you go.
See, we don't need to assign numbers to it. All right, my computer died. I think the only other item on our agenda is other business. The only thing I would bring up for the audience, the TV audience, this hat was found on the floor. If anybody's looking for it, it'll be in the high school Lost and Found.
Great hat.
Is this Fran?
I was going to say, it's Fran.
I think it's Fran, no?
I have a motion to adjourn. It does not require a second. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye. Aye. We stand adjourned. Thank you all very much again.